Pastor, fellow Toastmasters, and honored guests. One of my top 5 favorite movies of all time is the courtroom classic A Few Good Men, which takes place here in Washington, D.C., and the main trial scene that we all know and love actually only takes place a couple miles away from us in the Washington Navy Yard. And during the main trial, the JAG defense attorney, Lieutenant Daniel Caffey, which was made famous because he was played by Tom Cruise, is questioning the surly Guantanamo Bay Marine officer, Lieutenant Jonathan Kendrick, who was played by Kiefer Sutherland, on if a previous act of misconduct by one of his men was reported to the proper authorities. Kendrick smirks and replies, "I only have 2 books by my bedside, Lieutenant, the Marine Corps Code of Conduct and a King James Bible. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I tend to make major life rules by lines from my favorite movies. So I too only have 2 books by my bedstand, and that is the King James Bible and Robert's Rules of Order." Today, we're going to explore the wonderful world of parliamentary procedure, and we're going to look at 3 different tenets of running an efficient and fair meeting. We're first going to look at rights protected by parliamentary procedure. We're going to look at some of the principles and rules of parliamentary procedure, and then we're going to look at some common motions that are used during meetings. First area we're going to look at is the rights protected by parliamentary procedure. In Robert's Rules of Order, right at the beginning, it says that parliamentary law, we are concerned about the regards of rights of the majority, of the minority, of individual members, of absentees, and of all of these together. First of all, we want to look at the rights of the majority. In many of the organizations that we look at, we operate under the belief of majority rule. So that if a majority of the members believe a certain way, that is how that organization is going to be run. Parliamentary law always makes sure that if there's a majority opinion out there, that the organization is going to believe that. But on the other hand, parliamentary law also protects the rights of the minority. The minority is allowed to have their opinion heard. They're allowed to be able to express that opinion to the meeting as a whole. So even if, in the end, the organization isn't going to go with what the minority believes, they still have a right to have their opinion heard, and they have a right to be able to try and change the opinion of their organization. Individual members also have their rights protected. We want to be able to ensure that individual members have a right to speak during meetings, that they have a right to vote during meetings, and that they have a right to not be intimidated or insulted by other members of their organization. Something that is not often thought about, but absentees, people who aren't at the meeting, also have rights, and those rights are protected by parliamentary law. If one of the biggest ways that absentees are protected is at a quorum, that if many people are absent, the meeting, the organization isn't allowed to actually do business at all. So we are making sure that if there's a lot of people absent, or if you're absent, that doesn't mean that the organization can necessarily go and just go make decisions that are not in their best interests. And one of the biggest parts of parliamentary procedure is being able to balance all these interests. You have to look at all of these rights in total and make sure that one of these rights does not outbalance other of those. That you want to make sure that the organization as altogether is looked at in its proper fashion. So now that we've looked at the rights that parliamentary law protects, we're also going to look at some of the principles and rules. There are many principles and rules that parliamentary law has codified over the years, and no matter what parliamentary authority you're using, Robert's Rules of Order actually just happens to be one of the more common ones, and probably one of my favorite ones. But these are all principles and rules that parliamentary procedure looks at. First of all, parliamentary law always looks at the idea of one subject at a time. You don't want to be debating multiple things at the same time. It gets confusing for the body as a whole. It gets confusing for the individual members. You always want to make sure that you're focused on one thing at a time, so that the individual knows what they're voting on, and so that the organization knows exactly what they're moving forward with. There's a requirement that the chair always calls for the negative vote. You have the ability to vote yes on a motion, and you have the ability to vote no on a motion. It is important that both of these votes are called for. Sometimes you think, well, if everybody voted yes, there is no reason to call for a negative vote. Well, that's not true. That when something is actually not unanimous, you want to make sure that the right of the individual member is looked at so that they are able to give their opinion in front of the entire organization. You also want to look at decorum and avoidance of personalities in debate. This is another way of making sure that individual members' rights are protected. You always want to make sure that you are addressing the chairman specifically instead of individual members. You want to make sure that you are not insulting other members when you should really just be debating the merits of whatever one subject is going on at the time. It's being able to make sure that there's always proper decorum going on and that you're not insulting other members allows the organization to operate more smoothly. You also want to look at confinement of debate to the merits of the pending question. Many of these areas are ideas that go along with each other. You only want to be talking about one subject at a time, and you only want to be debating one subject at a time. If an organization is debating whether they should spend money on a certain object, you don't want to be confusing that debate with debate that should be taking place on another object. So if you are only debating the merits of the pending question, it's going to improve your debate and is going to allow for less confusion for the meeting as a whole. Another major principle and rule is that the requirements for changing a previous action are greater than those of taking the action in the first place. While the majority has the ability to pass whatever action it wants, you want to make sure that if the meeting attendance varies from week to week, that the majority rule the next week simply can't wipe out the actions of what a majority did before. This would not be assuring the rights of the absent members. When you pass a motion with a majority vote, it takes a majority of much larger than 50% to undo that action. This ensures that the organization's mission is clear and that if it wants to change something, it really has to have the support of the organization in order to do it. And another major principle and rule is that a deliberative body is a free agent, meaning it is free to do what it wants to do with its greatest measure of protection to itself and consideration for the rights of all of its members. This is something we talked about in our first point, that the rights of the majority are protected, that the organization, as long as it is not breaking any of the rules of its upper organizations or any of the laws in its city, state, or country, that it can really do whatever it wants, and that if the majority wants to do something, it should be allowed to do that, as long as it's not hurting the organization itself and it's not hurting the rights of its members. So far we've looked at rights protected by parliamentary law, and we've looked at some principles and rules of parliamentary law. So our third and final area is we're going to look at some motions that are commonly used at meetings. The first area we're going to look at is how we make a motion. Now, it has been a pet peeve of mine for a long time where somebody says, I make a motion that we do something. You do not say, I make a motion. The proper phrasing that you use is when you are making a motion, you say, I move that. And it is very important that you say, I move that, and then you say exactly what you want the organization to do. At that point, to make sure that it's not just one member who wants to do something, oftentimes the chairperson will ask for a second to make sure that there's at least two people in the organization who want to do something before it is able to be discussed by the entire group. A motion requires a majority vote to pass. A main motion requires a majority vote to pass. So, and after it has been debated properly, it can be voted on. Another common motion is something called previous question. There's a common misconception amongst meeting groups that all one has to do to end debate is to yell question, and then a vote has to take place. That's not true. That is taking away the rights of members who have not already debated. So, making a motion for previous question requires a 2/3 vote. Another popular motion is to adjourn a meeting. That is a motion, it's not debatable, it's not amendable, but it requires a majority vote to pass, and it can be made by any member who just wants to stop the meeting at that time. There are many, many other motions that are all gone through in Robert's Rules of Order, and I encourage you to look at them. Today, we have looked at the rights protected by parliamentary law, we've looked at some of the principles and rules of parliamentary law, and some motions that are made during meetings. Now, I don't know what books you have on your bedstand, and we all know you have a lot of books to read during the silly season, but I encourage you to look at Robert's Rules of Order so that you can use proper parliamentary procedure in your meetings. Mr. Toastmaster.